The grain of salt and the bowl of water. A lesson on opening the heart. In life, perhaps all of us have moments when suffering feels suffocating. Loss, wounds, careless words, or sudden misfortunes can weigh heavily on our hearts. Sometimes, just a small matter is enough to rob us of sleep, enough to make us feel as if the whole world is against us. Sitting in the narrow space of sorrow, we may think that suffering is everything, that it is permanent, that it is impossible to overcome. Long ago, a disciple came to the Buddha, lamenting that life was filled with too much suffering. The Buddha offered a simple yet profound image. He said, "If you put a handful of salt into a small bowl of water, the water will become salty and bitter, impossible to drink. But if you drop the same handful of salt into a vast lake, the water of the lake will remain fresh, pure, and able to quench your thirst." In the same way, when our hearts are narrow, suffering easily fills us up. But when our hearts are spacious, boundless, and open, suffering becomes small, dissolving in the vastness of compassion and wisdom. The image of salt and water seems so simple, yet it contains a deep truth about how we experience suffering. The nature of life is imperfect. We cannot avoid difficulties, sickness, separation, and loss. But what matters is not whether suffering is big or small. It is whether our hearts are narrow or wide, constricted or expansive. A person with a narrow, self-centered heart will feel crushed even by small troubles. A critical remark, an unfriendly glance, or a minor failure can weigh heavily on them. For such a person, the grain of salt falls into a small bowl, and their mind becomes salty and bitter. They drink from that very water and suffer. On the other hand, a person with an open heart, one that listens, loves, and looks upon life with compassion, will not be easily broken by suffering. The same grain of salt, when dropped into a vast lake, becomes meaningless. Such a person can still smile, walk peacefully, and continue to love and care for life. To open the heart does not mean to deny suffering. The salt remains in the water, just as pain still exists in life. But instead of being consumed by it, we learn to embrace and transform it. The Buddha never taught us to eliminate all suffering. That is impossible. He taught that we can transform our relationship with suffering. When the heart is vast, suffering naturally becomes lighter. The practice of opening the heart begins with small steps. When we sit quietly and follow our breathing, we realize that each breath can be an ocean. Breathing in, aware that I am alive, I am here, we naturally soften our irritation. When we learn to smile at our own mistakes, we also learn to smile at the mistakes of others. Then, the bowl of water within us gradually becomes a lake.
In daily life, we can cultivate this through compassion and wisdom. Compassion allows us to go beyond the limits of the ego. Wisdom helps us see that suffering is only a part of the impermanent flow of life. It comes and goes. It does not stay forever. With compassion and wisdom, we not only endure suffering, but also transform it into nourishment. Look back at what once caused you pain. Perhaps a failure of the past turned out to be a precious lesson that made you grow. Perhaps a loss opened your heart to see the value of love and presence. In this way, the grain of salt, instead of making life bitter, becomes the very seasoning that teaches us to cherish sweetness. To open the heart also means to see ourselves in a larger context. We realize that we are not the center of the universe. We are simply part of the great stream of life, where everyone has their own joys and sorrows. When we see that we are not everything, the burden becomes lighter. We no longer demand perfection from life.
No longer expect others to always please us. Such humility opens the door to true freedom. The story of the grain of salt and the bowl of water reminds us that suffering is an inseparable part of life. But suffering does not have to defeat us. It is the depth of our heart that determines whether we overcome it. When we live with a heart as vast as a great lake, the grains of suffering become too small to make life bitter. Therefore, instead of wishing for a life without suffering, let us learn to cultivate a boundless heart. When the heart is wide, suffering becomes small, and we can live peacefully amidst the storms of life. That is the Buddha's timeless teaching, simple yet eternal. When the heart is vast, suffering dissolves,